Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Concepts and Sit Down Startup, a podcast from Zendesk. I'm John Voorhees, and with me, as always, is Federico Vitici. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
Oh, another great day here at App Stories, just kind of hanging out. And I really enjoyed our last interview we did with Guy Rambo. That was a lot of fun, and I think listeners seem to enjoy it, too, based on the feedback we've been getting on Twitter. So we thought, today we'd do another.
That's a great idea, especially because we, all these developers and people that we know, we haven't gotten a chance to see them in person this year. So, at least we can do the podcast together. And that's not a replacement for the actual event and being at WWDC and talking to each other in person, but we'll still a pretty good replacement, I would say.
Yeah, the further we get into the summer, the more I feel that that effect of not having had the opportunity to talk to people and lots of people. We've talked to a few people, but not a lot. So, but today we are going to be speaking with David Smith, as you may know David as _David Smith on Twitter. Dave is the maker of WatchSmith and Pedometer Plus. A whole bunch of other apps too. I mean, Sleep Plus, Calzones, and a bunch of others. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Oh, great. Thank you for having me.
Dave, I want to just launch right in and start talking about watchOS because we want to talk. I think today I want to really focus on watchOS and a little Swift UI and then get into widgets, which we talked to Guy about a little bit last week too.
Yeah.
But on watchOS, you've been doing watch development since the very beginning, since the very first Apple Watch. And that's changed quite a bit over the time. And I was wondering if you could kind of walk me through how that's changed for you as a developer and kind of where things are today compared to those early days.
Sure. So, I mean, the very first version of watchOS, the apps were this weird hybrid system where in that first generation, the actual app itself would run on your phone and its UI would be projected onto the watch. And so there were all kinds of weird limitations and performance issues. And just in general, it was a very strange situation that all the actual performance was, actual app was on the phone and then it was being sent over. And then they replaced that and we did on-device extensions. But it still was built with this technology that's called WatchKit, which is a very kind of lightweight, not particularly capable UI and interaction system. And this is why in general in watchOS, you have very few things like sort of dynamic animations or user interaction, that it's primarily just, a static list with a button and you hit a button and it goes to another screen or it changes something. And it's very hard to do any kind of more dynamic thing. And it got better over time, but in general, that was the state of watchOS all the way through to watchOS 6. Which was last year's at WWDC, they introduced Swift UI, and specifically Swift UI came to the watch, and it allowed for the first time us to build watch applications that were sort of dynamic and rich and interactive, and in many ways are just the same as if I was writing the application for an iPhone or an iPad or a Mac or whatever, any kind of platform. There was no limitation placed on it sort of externally, and then that has continued to just sort of improve and get better, and in watchOS 7, sort of Swift UI is now everywhere. Like you can use Swift UI to make complications. The Swift UI system itself on the app itself has gotten a lot better, and especially with the new changes that they're doing where, essentially in watchOS 7, Force Touch has gone away. And so there's a lot of neat affordances and sort of things that they do in Swift UI to make that process sort of easier and better. And it's now we're in a place where, I can build a full, rich sort of dynamic application on the watch. And I can share components with the iPhone. It's Swift UI is the same on both platforms, and so it's been a really nice place now where it's like the watch feels just like sort of a peer platform to all the other Apple platforms, rather than feeling like kind of this weird, underpowered sort of side hobby project. It feels just full and rich, and in a lot of my applications that I've been working on this summer, it's really great to I have the same Swift UI code that's running across all of them, and so I have this great I can do so much more than I was ever able to back in those early sort of watchOS 1 and 2 days.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Concepts, the Infinite Canvas app that offers endless idea exploration. Ideal for visual thinking, note-taking, mind mapping, storyboards, sketching, illustration, graphic design, product design, architecture, and a whole lot more. Sketch, design, and communicate your ideas with liquid ink, editable vector lines, and flexible exports that work with any app. Create great-looking notes and drawings with the Designer Copic Color Palette licensed by 2 Corporation. Move vector lines, allowing you to organize and edit your ideas with simple gestures, drag and drop images, vector objects, and text straight onto the canvas for quick ideating and sketching. Design tools like grids, snap, shape guides, and scale measurement enable polished professional sketching for architects and designers. And automatic presentation mode lets you connect your device to a display for instant live sharing too. And the app's PDF feature allows you to mark up, edit, and create and sign documents. The app is used by designers and illustrators at places like Apple, Disney, HP, Nike, PlayStation, Unity, and other companies globally to sketch, design, and communicate visually. Concepts comes free as a basic sketching app with the ability to unlock features via a subscription or a one-time payment. To learn more, go to concepts.app. Again, to learn more about Concepts, the Infinite Canvas app that you really should be trying if you haven't already, is concepts.app. Our thanks to Concepts for their support of this episode and for supporting our entire Summer OS preview series.
So your most recent app, WatchSmith, right? It's a utility that runs on the iPhone but lets you create these custom complications for the watch. So can you go over some of the challenges that you faced? I believe last year you were working on WatchSmith. So you were working on the app when watchOS 6 was going to be the public version of watchOS. So can you describe the challenges that you faced then, but also now with watchOS 7, with all the changes coming to developers who want to offer complications on the watch? What's that going to mean for a utility like WatchSmith?
Sure. So I think the biggest challenges around complications, just in general, is that they're in many ways, complications are the primary interaction that most users have with their watch. That if you use your watch like a watch, then primarily you're raising your wrist to see the time and whatever information is being shown on the face. But because it's sort of ambiently available, and especially if you have a Series 5 Apple Watch where it's literally, it's always visible 24 hours a day, there's a lot of performance and battery constraints and things that are put on complications that make them just challenging to develop, because your goal is to try and have fresh, up-to-date information always on the wrist, but do that in a way that doesn't take a lot of battery. And so there's a lot of challenges in something like developing WatchSmith where it just, I have to work around those limitations and come up with sort of clever ways to try and, and some of them are just sort of like, for lack of a better word, just hacks. Like I have things that are trying to show the current time, specifically often in the context of like a time zone. So you can have a complication that shows the current time in a couple of different time zones. So, you can know what the time is in London and San Francisco and your own time at the same time. And there's no built-in way to do that in watchOS. And so I have to do these weird hacks where I'm like creating different complications for each minute of the day and trying to keep like adding those into the future, but you can only add so many at a time. And so there's all kind of limitations like that. And then the second thing I think is, especially in watchOS 6, was that an app could only export one complication for each type of complication. So if you imagine, say you have the infograph watch face, which is an analog face that has 4 complications in the middle and 4 in the corners and 1 on the bezel of the clock. I could provide one of those for each of those different sort of types, but I couldn't provide like 4 corners and things like that, which I think created a lot of confusion and sort of frustration with my customers, because it's like from their perspective, it's like, why can't I? It's like I want to see my weather in the weather in this and my time zones in the other corner. Like, why can't I do that? And it's like, from my perspective, I just can't, and that's unfortunate. And I think moving to watchOS 7, what is the big things that I got that I think will make WatchSmith much more sort of rich and straightforward is I can now export multiple complications. So I can you can have your all four corners in an infograph face, and I can dynamically address each of them so they can sort of have whatever content I have. And then additionally, they've now changed a lot of the things that we have in the way I create my complications, that they're all now built using Swift UI, which is much more rich and dynamic, and I can do a lot more in it. And even moreover, it's a lot more performant. It takes a lot. Previously, I had to do a lot of things where I'm rendering images and then having the system show it as an image, which is not particularly performant or kind of as efficient as I would like it to be. But as Swift UI, it's all very native, built in, low level, super efficient. And so I've seen a lot of improvements in terms of the performance that I get there. And I think the other big thing that I'm really excited about in watchOS 7 is we have face sharing, where we can take, I can sort of export a snapshot of a watch face in terms of which face it is and which complications are installed in what locations. And you can share that, and you can, have it be installed onto your watch by the OS. And so it gets around a lot of the confusion that I think I've been running into a lot of times with my users. Is they get the iPhone app, they set up a watch face, and then there's this big chasm from there to how do I actually show this on my wrist? And I have to have, walkthrough videos of how you can go to the companion app and you click on the face you want, and then you go to the complications area, and then you click on the particular complication that you're interested in, and you need to scroll that list until it says WatchSmith, and make sure that it's the same one that you think you've configured in the app. And so that, you don't accidentally have something that you configured as a corner show up in the middle, and then it's showing the wrong data. And so I'm very excited to be able to just provide basics. Essentially what I'm expecting to do is I can provide templates, and I can say, so you can configure what you want the watch face to look like all within WatchSmith, and you hit install to your watch, and then it can go ahead and put that onto the watch for you. And I think that will make the user experience of that and getting sort of over the sort of that chasm between setting it up and actually using it much smaller. So those are things I'm definitely very excited about in sort of coming in watchOS 7 that sort of clean up a lot of the lingering issues that I was running into before.
Yeah, those limitations of things like not being able to have, both the time zone and the weather in the same complication is very confusing. I still find it confusing even though I understand it. I mean, why do you think that existed originally?
I think with a lot of things in the watch, there is just this sense that I'm not sure if Apple knew what the watch was going to be when they started making the watch. And there's a lot more kind of technical and just sort of structural limitations that they have to overcome to get through that. And so I don't think necessarily that when they were building the original version of the complication system that they imagined an app like WatchSmith that's going to be dynamically scheduling different complications to appear throughout the day, and that you would have multiple of them that are all doing different things. I think they imagined a much simpler app model where there is kind of a one-to-one correspondence where, you have, if I have pedometer plus plus, and it shows you your steps, it seems a bit silly that you're going to have your steps twice on the watch face. But at the same time, they also, in the earlier versions, they did do this for things like weather, where the built-in weather app could show you the precipitation, the chance of rain as well as the temperature. And there are two different complications, both exported from the same app. So sometimes it's hard to know exactly why, but I feel like a lot of this is just, they continue, the watch is definitely a platform that is still relatively young and is starting from such a constrained place from a performance and battery life that they're still doing the incremental opening of the platform. Certainly as watches get more capable, as they're able to deprecate some of the older watches that were even more limited, they're able to kind of get rid of a lot of this baggage. And I think that is now letting them open up and feel more comfortable, having sort of third-party apps just do more and be more capable.
Yeah, that makes sense. You've talked a little bit about Swift UI, and I wanted to follow up on that because the story around Swift UI, I feel like in 2019, it was a little confusing because it came in at the same time as Mac Catalyst, and there was this tension between, what's the future here? Is the future Mac Catalyst? Is that temporary? Is Swift UI the future? But at the same time, Swift UI was kind of a watch-only thing last year, but now it's been broadened out from that. And I feel like the story has gotten a lot more clear in 2020, but but where do you see it fitting into just kind of the entirety of the ways that developers can make apps? Because I think for a lot of people who don't make apps, it's a little confusing now that there's so many different ways that apps can be made for everything from the watch on up to the Mac.
I think I think there was a clarity of vision this year that was definitely was lacking in last year's WWDC, where I think Apple is clearly saying their desire is that developers move towards a model where they are writing their apps for all Apple platforms. And that is kind of the default, that it isn't that you are writing for you targeting one thing. It's like their goal is that you would target all the platforms. And you see this in, Apple Silicon Macs running iPhone apps. Like there's lots of this kind of just general sense that they want, not that all the platforms are the same, that they're all they have distinct characters and characteristics, but that a developer who's like a good citizen of the Apple platforms is addressing all of them in whatever ways can make sense for their application. And I think Swift UI is in many ways, their directive to make that process easier for new apps. And Catalyst is the bridge to sort of bring along the older existing code bases to that vision. But it's the exact same goal, but it's just doing it in sort of two different ways. That if you are starting a new app today, I think Apple is very clearly saying, we recommend that you make this in Swift UI because it'll allow you to much more easily target all of our different Apple platforms, like from the watch to tvOS, giant screens to teeny screens. You can have a lot more of a consistent view there. And it's the way in which you have to build a Swift UI application lends itself to being more platform agnostic, to being able to be shared more fully. And that's their sort of general goal. And then I think things like Catalyst exist primarily it supports Swift UI, that there are certain things that if you're currently, like if you wanted to do something on the Mac and Swift UI doesn't support it, you need Catalyst as kind of like the fallback to be able to do it. But I think is there for all the existing applications that otherwise just you're never going to rewrite in Swift UI. And so Catalyst is kind of like that bridge just to kind of help them realize this vision on a broader basis rather than starting from, this year with Swift UI. They're able to start with all of the existing applications that are able to be brought to the Mac in some form, much more straightforwardly.
Yeah, that makes sense. To what degree are you using Swift UI on the iOS side of your apps?
So I'm in sort of following Apple's lead with that, and so I'm using it. So all my any new work that I'm doing on iOS, I'm doing exclusively in Swift UI. I'm using UIKit and the older style of applications only for when I have existing applications that I'm working, or like in an existing application, I may even start to share. And, so there'll be, if I'm building out a new feature, I might build it in Swift UI. And the two can coexist pretty happily. And so that's where I'm going. And mostly, I think for me, it's a perspective of this is clearly where Apple is putting their efforts. And so I want to be as much of an expert in that technology as I can. And rather than kind of waiting and seeing and, in 3 years when it is fully mature and it is fully realized, because it's still certainly, it's Swift UI is 1 year sort of old in the public. And so it's not nearly as capable as UIKit is. It's a situation where I want to make sure that I have expertise in this future technology. And so I'm using it everywhere I can. And I'm working on sort of 2 new apps this summer, and both of them are entirely written in Swift UI for that reason.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Sit Down Startup, a podcast from Zendesk. How do you start up when the world is upside down? Sit Down Startup is a new weekly podcast from Zendesk. The startup team brings together entrepreneurs, founders, and CEOs to discuss the latest business challenges and how to put customer experience at the heart of success. The podcast is brand new, and I love the format. The show has just got started at the end of June, so there's plenty of time to jump in right away and get up to speed. Each episode is an interview with an entrepreneur or founder of a company about a different aspect of starting a business, especially in a challenging environment like the one everyone faces now. What I love about the episodes is that they're the sort of casual, low-key conversations that you have with someone at a coffee shop. Each episode is about a half an hour long, and they're perfect for when you're out for a walk, running an errand in your car, or wherever else you are and have a little extra time. I listened to a fantastic episode that was an interview with Derek Anderson of Startup Grind, a group that brings together entrepreneurs from all over the world to help support each other. Anderson emphasized building communities as a way to reach out to your customers and make them allies to your brand. It was a terrific conversation. You too can hear from people that understand unpredictability in a coffee shop style conversation. Catch weekly episodes on Apple, Google, and Spotify. Just search for Sit Down Startup in your podcast player or click on the link in our show notes. Our thanks to Sit Down Startup for helping to guide entrepreneurs and for their support of the show.
So, Dave, I want to switch to widgets, as I feel
Sure.
you may be the person who knows just a couple of things about them.
Yeah.
So I'm working on my review of iOS 14, and in writing the section about widgets, something that I keep coming back to is the idea that, and I mean, Apple even, they said pretty much the same thing at WWDC, how in building these new widgets that can go on the home screen on iOS 14, they took a lot of lessons that they learned in making complications on the watch.
Yes.
And sort of this idea of glanceability and timely updates, and starting from those core principles and adapting them to be at the foundation of these new widgets. Do you feel like there's this parallel between complications and widgets? And do you think this is what are some of the important factors to consider when thinking about the new widget system for iOS 14?
So I think it is definitely clear that the widget system is built almost explicitly on the same system that the complication system on the watch is built on. That technically and structurally, I feel like I'm in a much better place working with widgets, having spent so much time working on complications, because just the way in which Apple has structured things and the way in which you provide data to it and the way in which you kind of provide a timeline of data. So, if you're creating a weather app and you want to have different, every hour of the day, you want to show the sort of the temperature or the forecasted temperature. The way in which you would do that in complications is exactly the same way that you do that in widgets. And I think it certainly speaks to, obviously Apple thinks that approach that they took in watchOS for complications is the sort of the right one. And they're certainly benefiting from, the years of experience working on that on watchOS and seeing how performant they can make it and how kind of predictable and clear they can do that. And I think that definitely means that, like, I think that seems to by far be the most underlying sort of goal with widgets. And I think it helps, as a developer, helps me to frame what their expectations are for what I should think of as a widget. That with the old sort of the old kind of widget system, you could do anything really, but you just had a limited canvas for it. Like they were full blown apps, but you could, they would sort of be running in this weird context. Whereas an iOS 14 widget, like a home screen widget, it's not an app. It is in many ways, it's best to think of it as just a statically rendered image that is being shown, and you can stack and coordinate when they are shown in the future and what is being shown at any given time. But it's not an app. It is in the same way that a complication is not an app, that you don't interact with the complication. You might tap on it and it launches the app that is associated with it, but it is not in and of itself an application. And I think that is an intentional choice to avoid there's a lot of really weird and complicated things that you end up with if you get away from this model where the home screen is a place that is, in many ways static, and the live and dynamic behaviors of the iPhone happen within applications. That gets like very strange and complicated in a lot of interesting ways that I think Apple is intentionally trying to stay away from. And additionally, just avoiding a lot of the performance and issues that you run into if they went the other way. Because I've built the old style widgets as well, and they were kind of a nightmare to deal with things like refresh in, because for performance reasons, your app wasn't running on a regular basis. And so as soon as the person, your user would swipe to the left on their home screen to get to the widget system, and then there's always this period, there's this 1 or 2 seconds where the app has to spring to life and work out what it's supposed to show. And provide that data right then, and there's no way for that to be immediate. And I think Apple is, especially because now it's your actual home screen. You unlock the phone and swipe to it, and it has to be right there. And that's the same goal that, I mean, I remember the very first complications talk at WWDC, whatever that was, 5 years ago. That was like one of the key principles they kept sort of harping on, is that their goal with complications is that you never see a loading state, that you never see this weird half state where the app doesn't know what to show, because the nature of it is that you're trying to always be providing data into the future. That is, to the best degree you can, there's always something to show there. And that seems to be exactly the same thing they want with widgets.
Mm-hmm. So there's this interesting idea that Guy mentioned on the last interview that we did, and how widgets in iOS 14 they may not behave like apps. They're not mini apps, functionally speaking, but visually speaking, they can sort of look like mini versions of apps, because Swift UI and WidgetKit allow you to have this fuller and richer canvas, right? To design a custom interface that can resemble the brand and the theme of your application. And so what I wanted to ask you is, so you're building WidgetSmith, which is the sort of the widget version of WatchSmith. I guess I can sum it up as such. Yeah. So the idea that it allows you to create all kinds of widgets. So because you're now, I guess I'm wondering how you can balance the idea that you can bring some of your design, some of the app's identity to the home screen, but how can you balance that with the fact that users in WidgetSmith, I suppose, just like in WatchSmith, can design whatever they want? So maybe you don't necessarily want to sort of enforce a particular type of UI, because it's up to the user to decide what kind of widgets they want to create. So how can you balance that user freedom with the fact that you as a developer also have the freedom to bring a much more richer and flexible interface to widgets now?
Yeah, and so I think, WidgetSmith, I think specifically has an easier case with this kind of a problem than a lot of my other applications in some ways, because the point of WidgetSmith is that it's letting the user configure exactly what they want the widget to look like. And so I am giving them the control over what colors they want it to be, what fonts they want it to have in. So if they have a particular aesthetic that they have for their home screen, and that's what they want to configure it as, like they could have a super dark background with light text, or they could have, be super colorful, or have rounded fonts or serif fonts, or however they want to do it. And so in many ways, WidgetSmith is the approach where I don't impose much of the kind of the aesthetic to it. It's a choice that the user makes. But I think in some of my other applications, there is definitely this challenge and this tension around, like, I think of for most people, their home screen is something that they care about how it looks. And it is something that they want it to look good, and they want it to look in a way that, like, they're going to look at it a lot, and it's something that you care about, and like you'll have a background that you like the look of, and so you want to make. I think in general, there's this sort of, in my approach so far has largely been to try and not impose too much of my app aesthetic into it, and make it relative, just sort of making it something that can fit in a much more kind of in broader context, in the way that it's almost like, I think of there's certain types of clothing that you can, like, you sort of like, will fit in anywhere. Like if I wear a black button-down shirt and some nice jeans and some brown shoes, I can fit in most contexts. But if I was wearing like this super vibrant sort of super colorful t-shirt with like big puffy pants and like pink shoes, I'm not going to fit in nearly as many contexts. There are some contexts where I would totally fit in, but in general, I'm not going to. And so in general, I'm kind of trying to design my widgets around, I want to be as something that looks good. Like, the guy wearing the black button down and nice jeans looks good, but it's not nearly as sort of, doesn't have nearly as much personality and sort of strength to it. And I think generally that's going to be a good approach for widgets, because they're going to have to coexist with the UIs of so many other apps. And I think I'm leading to a place where my home screen doesn't have any app icons on it anymore. Like, as I've been using iOS 14, I'm moving essentially to all widgets and then the app library. And that means that all of these widgets have to coexist and hopefully not look awful with each other. And so like trying to have a bit more of a muted appearance and something that if you have a little bits of personality from your application, if you have key colors or a font or kind of a general design that you can put into a widget, that makes sense. But the general thinking that I'm having is that it's better to fit in this context than to be super out there, because it's just not going to fit in. And if it doesn't fit in, I'm not going to want to put that on my home screen that I have to look at, 100 times a day.
Yeah, it's really interesting with widgets and and the app library and how those two things work together, because I haven't gone quite to the point where I'm all widgets, but I've for years now, I've relied primarily on search anyway to find apps beyond the first or second page. And I think now, that's especially for people who have done that and have a lot of apps, that this is going to be a great system to try to, surface more information more easily and quickly when you open your phone up. Dave, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about WidgetSmith and what have been some of the challenges technically. I mean, I've talked a little bit about the design challenges, but what about the technical challenges in putting that together?
The biggest technical challenge with an app like that is just trying to understand all the different uses that you would have for a widget. And so it's a brand new technology that doesn't have a lot of expectations. And on the watch, one of the small sort of upsides about the watch being a relatively constrained environment is that there's only so many things that I can do. And what I'm running into in WidgetSmith is that there is so many APIs and abilities that Apple has built into the iPhone at this point, and in the iPad as well. But it's the number of different technologies that I'm having to interface with, because I may as well. It seems like something that I should be doing, that if you want to, you can interact with your calendar, or you can interact with your reminders, or with your photos, or with all of the HealthKit stuff. There's lots and lots of different technologies. And because the canvas is so much bigger, there are so many more kind of possibilities and things that I have to sort of consider. Because the nice thing about a complication is most of them are these teeny little wid things that you can only show 2 words in, and that's it. That's at a, for most of them, you're limited by the space. I mean, whereas the largest widget size, that large size, is huge. It's it's bigger than many iPhone screens used to be, and you have the whole canvas that you can put something into. And so I think from a technical perspective, it's just trying to deal with that size and make it look good and reasonable. And then I think the other challenge is the same as the one that I faced on the watch, but I benefit from my experience there. It's just there's all the same challenges around having data be kept up to date and sort of live and active and showing you the correct data at the correct time. And some of that is just always going to be a challenge. That some of the things that I'm running into are if one of my widgets is a calendar widget that shows you your upcoming events, and if you go to, you change your calendar, me being able to show that change in a timely way is just difficult, because the nature of that change, that it's entirely unpredictable. I can't know when you did it, and there's no sort of system notification that I'm necessarily going to get woken up to be told about. And so there's just a lot of sort of, I have to blend together a lot of different approaches to try and be aware of that change, but in a way that isn't constantly sort of churning through the user's battery by constantly in the background being did the calendar change? Did the calendar change? Did the calendar change?
Right.
And so those, I think, are the biggest technical challenges. And a lot of this is just because WidgetSmith is a much more kind of, it's omnivorous. It's going for all of the data, and it's not something that is just doing one thing or providing just a view into a particular data stack, where you could use, push notifications and some of the other technologies that would allow you to have that kind of real-time changing. But I think generally, technically, it's not actually, it's been a lot more straightforward than certainly than it was originally building WatchSmith. And I think, iOS is also just a nice, it's such a mature platform to be working on, that it's just been really a sort of a joy to be able to run it on there. From it, it's my iPhone 11 is super fast and does all the things I want, and it's a really sort of a pleasant place to work in a way that the watch can sometimes, if I'm doing development on a Series 3 Apple Watch, like things take a lot longer than I would like them to.
Right. I guess big picture, one thing that some of what you've said raises is a question in my mind is whether the timeline-based approach to widgets is the right one. I know we're still pretty early in the betas, but I've noticed with some of Apple's, including like the weather widget, there'll be times when it's middle of the afternoon and it's still showing me the weather from like 6 a.m. when I first got out of bed.
Yeah.
Do you think that's the right approach, the timeline-based one?
So I think the timeline-based approach is, I think it's probably the right approach, but it's going to have consequences. The challenge is still the alternative version is that Apple is the alternative version would be something typically where it rather than providing data into the future, whenever the system wants data, it asks you for it, and you have that kind of like the system is pulling that data out of the application rather than the app is kind of pushing this out into the future. But the nature of any of the kind of that approach is that there's always going to be latency, and there's always going to be sort of work that is hard to predict and that is going to be difficult from a performance perspective. That's just the nature of that. And I think Apple is sort of rightly taking the approach that they want to. They're erring on the side of performance and predictability rather than something that could necessarily be always up to date, sort of by definition. And I get it, and I think it's a limiting choice, but I think on balance it's probably the right choice, and it certainly is something that they're going into with a lot of experience on the watch, that they know how it works there, and they know the downsides. And I think for most applications, it's not going to be a downside that is very problematic. And I think especially because iOS has such a broader range of capabilities from a performance perspective that they can dial up how conservative it is. They can be much less conservative than they are on the watch. And so one thing that I've definitely noticed in iOS 14, and it changes from beta to beta, but the general sense seems to be that if I ask the system to refresh my timeline on a regular basis, that I get very regular updates in a way that on the watch, that was much more unpredictable. And there are certainly times where, especially if you start to get into a low battery situation on your watch, you just would never be updated ever again. And whatever data you last provided is what the system will show forever. Whereas I've seen that much less often on the phone, and it kind of makes sense that the phone is they're so much more powerful. They have such larger batteries. And so I think the system is able to be much more aggressive in the way that it schedules things. And but this approach scales so much better than the alternative, where if you imagine a screen where, like, I'm trying to think how many widgets you could have at any one time. You could probably have widgets from 6 different apps on a screen, and you could have an unlimited number of them sort of live on your home screen at any one time. Sort of the thought of them having, in order for it to show data, for them to have to bring up all of those apps essentially and launch them concurrently so that you would have 6 different applications running at the same time, all doing whatever it is they need to do to get data, seems largely untenable and would probably very quickly lead to other problems. Whereas this way they can launch essentially most of, the widget updating is happening in the background, not concurrently. I imagine they refresh one widget and then they refresh the next widget and they refresh the next widget. And all of those updates might happen within 5 seconds, but it never had to refresh them all, bring them all up at the same time. And that leads to all kinds of memory benefits. And the more I've kind of gotten used to this, I think this is the approach that they had to take from a technical reason. And I think overall it's a reasonable approach. It's not ideal. Ideally, the apps are always running all the time, and they can do all the things but that kind of only really would make sense to me in a context where you didn't have to care about performance or battery, which is definitely not the case on iOS.
So Dave, I want to close this conversation by talking to you about sleep tracking. So
sure.
At WWDC, Apple announced one of the new watchOS 7 features that also has, of course, an iOS component, built-in sleep tracking. And it's integrated with the Health app, and you get some features on the watch. You have a sleep app on the watch. You have a sleep mode on the iPhone. You have wind down shortcuts and all of that stuff. So you wrote how you thought that despite, Apple coming into this space with a native solution, that you think overall it's going to have a net positive impact on your application Sleep++. Now, it's been a almost 2 months, just over a month at this point. Do you still feel the same about sleep tracking on the watch, sort of having this competition from Apple? Do you think that it will still be good for a third-party utility like yours?
I do, and I think if honestly, the more I use Apple sleep tracking, like that, it's running on my my sort of testing watches that I'm wearing, running watchOS 7. I think I get even more confident that that's the case because I think Apple has clearly and explicitly taken a minimalist approach to this. That they're bringing sleep tracking to the watch in a way that, like, as someone who hears from a lot of people who are interested in sleep tracking for their watch, in my customer support and just I've made a sleep app for years now. Their approach has lots of limitations, and it's the kind of situation where I think it's so minimalist to a degree that it makes me think that it is intentionally minimalistic, that it is an approach that they are taking so that they don't sort of step on the existing ecosystem of users, but also start to introduce people to sleep tracking as a thing that the Apple Watch can do. Because I think the biggest hurdle sleep tracking faces on the Apple Watch, is battery life, is that people have to feel confident that they can wear their watch, essentially overnight without having to charge it overnight. And that has certainly gotten a lot better over the years with, sort of battery performance in watchOS, but it's something that they've had to kind of work towards. And then so like you have to have good enough battery life, and then you have to have people who think that this is something that's worth tracking and that they think of when they think of an Apple Watch, they think about it as a sleep tracker. And their approach is very, I'm honestly, it's very unexpected. Like, it's not at all what I was necessarily expecting Apple to do. It's very behaviorally focused rather than data focused. It's very much seems to be around trying to encourage you to get better sleep, not necessarily about trying to analyze your sleep or tell you deep kind of insights into your sleep or kind of the things that a lot of third-party apps tend towards. Like, they're very much more focused on just trying to increase or like make you aware of the volume of sleep that you're accumulating, not necessarily telling you anything about it. And I don't think that's because they can't tell you more about it. Like, I imagine they have some of the, I've interacted with them at WWDC. Like, they have some of the best data scientists and kind of people you could imagine to analyze the data that's being collected. I'm sure they are capable of collecting way more data than they are currently sort of showing to users. But I think it's a conscious choice. And I think it's driven. They've certainly said this publicly, and I think it seems consistent with what they've shipped, that their approach to sleep tracking is very much oriented around giving you prompts and cues, but recognizing that sleep is different than a lot of other performance and fitness metrics that the Apple Watch collects, because it's not something that you have direct control over, that it is something that you have influence on. Like, you can take behaviors that might influence your sleep, but you don't control it. It's not like when you get to the end of it, you get a notification from the activity app, now the fitness app, but it's like when you get those notifications that says, like, hey, you're close to close, you're 6 minutes of exercise away from closing your exercise ring. Why don't you go for a brisk walk? With sleep, it's like you wake up in the morning and they, your sleep goal was 7 hours of sleep and you only slept for 5.5 hours. Them saying, hey, you're a little short on sleep. I think you should sleep another hour and a half. Like, doesn't work the same way. Right. It's not like, oh yeah, I woke up. It's like, well, I woke up because my child was crying and I needed to help them, or I have a meeting, or I'm doing things. Like, sleep is influenced by so many other things, and it can often feel punitive too. That, like, it's like if you pop up and say, like, you didn't meet your sleep goal, it's like, well, great. What am I going to do? I can't do anything with that. Whereas with something that's more sort of proactive and conscious, like the activity ring stuff, they can encourage you and say, hey, you're a little behind where you were yesterday. Maybe you should try and do something about that. And so I think they've made a lot of choices to do sort of down that path that is much more sort of light touch. Just, hey, it seems like, you set a goal and we'll roughly tell you what it is. And every time you do hit your goal, we'll affirm that. And you'll get a little notification that says, like, hey, great job. You've hit your sleep goal, 4 out of the last 6 nights, or whatever you've done. And I think that leaves open a huge opportunity for third-party developers like myself. And I think because what it does is it means that they're conditioning people that the Apple Watch is a platform that is good for sleep tracking. And all of the data that they continue to collect continues to only benefit third-party sleep trackers like mine. And I expect what's going to happen, at least my expectation based on previous kind of similar circumstances, is what it's going to do is it means that people are going to go to the app. So like they're going to get that basic experience. They're going to start wearing their watches overnight. And then they're going to look at the Apple thing and they're going to start to ask, like, is there more? And I think so many more people are going to be interested in sleep tracking and are going to be aware of it as something they can do, that it's going to increase overall the interest in sleep tracking for apps like mine. And I can provide different insights and provide information about how you're sleeping in a way that Apple isn't showing you. That I can get a little bit more detailed about the quality of your sleep, or show you trends and information about what is a typical night look like for you, and how you might be able to kind of make choices based on that information. Like that's a great opportunity that I think I can have, and it's nice that Apple is the data that they're providing and their analysis about when you're asleep, they're just writing to the health app, and I can pull that in and use it to improve my sleep model, because they're obviously accessing data that I don't have access to, and they're doing it throughout the night, and I can use that to even improve my own model. So it's like overall, it seems like a net win for sleep trackers, because they're not coming in with this big, heavy-handed approach that does everything you could ever possibly imagine, and kind of eliminate the need for anyone to think about using a third-party app.
Yeah, it's a really interesting approach. I wasn't expecting it either, and it what's interesting to me about it is, as you say, is that it's really adjacent to the existing crop of sleep tracking apps out there. I mean, I don't think that that Apple's approach really is like any other sleep tracking apps that at least I've tried. So that's an interesting path for them to go down. David, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been great talking to you about all this. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things coming this fall, and it sounds like you've really got your hands busy this summer. So
sure.
Thanks for being on.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure.
Dave, where could people find you online if they want to follow your work?
Sure. So, the best place is probably so you can follow me on Twitter. I'm _David Smith there. Or I write a blog where I post kind of all my new applications and things that I work on. That's at david-smith.org.
All right, great. And I want to thank our two sponsors again for this episode, and that is Concepts and Sit Down Startup, a podcast from Zendesk. You can find Federico over on Twitter and Instagram. He's at Viticci, that's VITICCI, and I'm at John Voorhees, JOHN VOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.